Welcome back to the channel. For 14 months, an entire region of Southern California was afraid to sleep with their windows open. A man was breaking into homes in the middle of the night, choosing his victims almost entirely at random. Elderly couples, young women living alone, families who had simply left a window unlatched on a warm evening. He left behind satanic symbols at some of his crime scenes. He shot, stabbed, and strangled his way across 2 counties, then, without warning, took his violence 350 miles north to San Francisco. Police had almost nothing to go on. No consistent physical description witnesses could agree on. No consistent method beyond sheer, calculated brutality. A fingerprint sat unmatched in a filing system for months, because the technology needed to search it quickly simply did not exist yet. He had already been arrested once, months into his spree, for something completely unrelated. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and released, walking free to continue exactly what he had been doing all along, with no one in the room realizing who he actually was. Then, in the final days of a computer system that had only just come online, that fingerprint finally produced a name. Within 48 hours, an entire city would see his face on the front page of every newspaper. And the very next morning, ordinary citizens on a street in East Los Angeles would do what months of police work alone could not. They would catch him themselves. This is the complete story of Richard Ramirez, the man newspapers called the Night Stalker. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real, true crime cases every week, breaking down exactly what happened, how investigators finally cracked the case, and how justice was, or wasn't, ultimately served. And if you're already subscribed, tap that like button. It helps this video reach more people who only remember the nickname and never heard the full story. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children born to Mexican immigrant parents, Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. His childhood was marked by both physical and psychological trauma. Around the age of 5, Ramirez suffered a serious head injury after being struck while playing on a swing set, an incident that appears to have triggered temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that caused him to experience grand mal seizures throughout his early school years. Aside from the epilepsy, he was otherwise considered a healthy, if hyperactive and aggressive child, growing up alongside 4 older siblings in a household that struggled with its own internal tensions. His father, according to multiple accounts from people who knew the family, was a heavy drinker, prone to physically abusive outbursts, creating an unstable home environment that stood in sharp contrast to the ordinary working-class immigrant household his parents had otherwise tried to build. The most significant influence on young Ramirez, by nearly every account of his early life, was his older cousin, Miguel, known to the family as Mike. Mike had recently returned from serving in the Vietnam War, and the two grew close during Ramirez's early adolescence, spending long stretches of time together while the rest of the family largely left them alone. Mike would tell his younger cousin detailed, graphic stories about the war, including claims of having raped and tortured Vietnamese women, sometimes backing up these stories with photographs, images Ramirez would later describe, as an adult, as having left a lasting, formative impression on him. He also taught Ramirez military tactics, including methods for moving quietly and killing with stealth. Skills Ramirez would later apply directly to his own crimes years afterward. When Ramirez was 13 years old, he witnessed his cousin Mike fatally shoot his own wife in the face during a domestic dispute, a moment of sudden, close-range violence that Ramirez himself later described as a pivotal memory from his adolescence. Mike was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was institutionalized for several years, but the two cousins resumed their close relationship after his eventual release, continuing to spend time together even after everything Ramirez had witnessed. In the years that followed, Ramirez began breaking into homes, spending time in cemeteries, and developing a serious drug habit that started with marijuana and eventually escalated to cocaine, moving from occasional recreational use into a dependency that would follow him for the rest of his life. He dropped out of high school before completing the 9th grade, drifting increasingly toward petty crime and away from any of the ordinary structures, school, steady work, family stability, that might otherwise have redirected him. In his late teens, he relocated to Los Angeles, where his petty criminal history continued to grow, including arrests for auto theft and drug possession, none of which at the time drew any particular attention from investigators. To the police who processed these minor cases, Ramirez was simply one more young transient drifting through the city's criminal justice system, indistinguishable from thousands of similar low-level offenders passing through the same courts every year. Richard Ramirez's confirmed killing spree began on June 28, 1984, in Glassell Park, a neighborhood in Los Angeles. He broke into the home of a 79-year-old woman, stabbed her repeatedly, and slashed her throat, nearly decapitating her in the process. Over the following months, similar attacks began occurring across Los Angeles and its surrounding suburbs, escalating in both frequency and brutality as the months went on. Ramirez typically broke into homes late at night, usually through an unlocked window or door, catching residents completely off guard while they slept, exploiting the basic, ordinary sense of safety most people feel inside their own homes. His attacks were marked by extreme, often excessive violence, frequently combined with sexual assault, robbery, and, at a number of crime scenes, satanic symbols left behind deliberately, including pentagrams drawn on walls or on the bodies of his victims themselves, details that quickly became a defining, chilling signature of the entire case. His targets showed no consistent pattern in age, gender, or background. He killed elderly victims and young adults alike. He attacked people living alone and married couples together in the same home, sometimes killing one partner while assaulting the other in an adjoining room. This deliberate randomness, whether intentional on his part or simply a reflection of pure opportunism, made it extraordinarily difficult for investigators to predict where or when he might strike next, since there was no obvious demographic or geographic pattern to warn any single community that they might be at greater risk than any other. By early 1985, as the pattern of killings continued to grow, Los Angeles and its surrounding communities fell into a state of genuine, sustained panic, unlike anything the region had experienced in decades. Hardware stores across the region reported selling out of deadbolts, window locks, and security bars within days of restocking. Gun sales climbed sharply, with some stores reporting waiting lists for the first time in memory. Residents installed motion-activated floodlights and started sleeping with weapons within reach, and reported home burglary alarms and false alarms spiked dramatically as anxious homeowners startled at every unfamiliar sound. Local news programs ran near-nightly updates as the death toll climbed, and area sheriff's hotlines were flooded with thousands of tips, most leading nowhere, but each one requiring investigators limited time and attention to properly rule out. Los Angeles County Sheriff's detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo were assigned to lead the investigation, working to connect what initially appeared to be a scattered series of unrelated home invasion murders across multiple jurisdictions, each handled, at first, by a different local department, with no formal reason to compare notes with its neighbors. Piecing together ballistics evidence, physical descriptions from surviving victims, and crime scene details, they gradually built a case that all of these attacks were the work of a single offender, someone the media had already begun referring to, based on his pattern of nighttime break-ins, as the Night Stalker, a name that would come to define one of the most frightening chapters in modern Los Angeles history. As the case file grew, investigators identified several consistent details that helped tie individual attacks together into a single, unfolding spree, even as the sheer geographic and demographic randomness of his victims made the overall pattern difficult to summarize in any simple way. Ramirez frequently wore dark clothing and gloves or socks over his hands to avoid leaving fingerprints, showing a level of premeditation that unsettled detectives working the case, who noted that he seemed to understand exactly what kind of evidence would be used against him and took deliberate steps to minimize it. At several crime scenes, investigators recovered a distinctive shoe print, eventually identified as coming from a size 11.5 Avia sneaker, a specific detail that would later prove critical in linking multiple attacks to the same person. The same print turned up pressed into wet cement at one crime scene and on the side of a victim's head at another. Ballistics analysis also connected the same firearm to several of the shootings, providing additional forensic confirmation that a single individual was responsible, even before investigators had any name to attach to that conclusion. Survivors of his attacks, though traumatized and often unable to see him clearly in the dark, provided investigators with fragmentary but consistent physical descriptions. A slim build, dark hair, and in several accounts, notably poor dental hygiene and decayed teeth, a detail linked to Ramirez's long-time diet of junk food and years of drug use. These fragments, pieced together across dozens of separate attacks, slowly built toward a composite picture of the man responsible, even without a name or a confirmed photograph to match it to. By the summer of 1985, the attacks had expanded beyond the Los Angeles area entirely. Ramirez traveled north to San Francisco, where he committed additional murders, further widening the geographic scope of a case that was already stretching local law enforcement resources to their limit, and complicating an investigation that now had to coordinate across an even greater distance and yet another separate police jurisdiction. As 1985 wore on, the sheer unpredictability of the attacks began to reshape daily life across an enormous stretch of Southern California. Parents drove their children to school rather than letting them walk, even in broad daylight, out of a general, diffuse anxiety that had spread far beyond any specific evidence of daytime risk. Community meetings drew standing room crowds as residents pressed local officials and police representatives for updates, reassurance, or simply a place to voice their fear collectively. Task force detectives found themselves fielding an overwhelming volume of calls from residents reporting suspicious neighbors, strange cars, or unfamiliar faces in their communities, each one requiring some level of follow-up, even as the vast majority led nowhere. Some residents, in the absence of any reliable official guidance about what a suspect might actually look like, grew suspicious of anyone who seemed even slightly out of place, a level of collective anxiety that itself became a defining feature of the period, separate from the actual violence driving it. The single most important piece of evidence in the entire case had actually been sitting in police files for months before anyone realized its significance. On December 12, 1984, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, months before investigators had even connected the full scope of the Night Stalker's crimes, a Los Angeles police sergeant named Roberto Alaniz stopped and arrested a man driving a stolen vehicle in West Los Angeles. It was, on its face, a completely routine traffic stop, the kind of minor auto theft arrest that officers across the city handled without a second thought several times a week. During booking, the department took the man's fingerprints and mugshot, as was standard procedure, before releasing him after processing on the relatively minor charge. That man was Richard Ramirez. At the time, there was no way to quickly cross-reference his fingerprints against evidence from the still unfolding Night Stalker case, because Los Angeles did not yet have a computerized fingerprint matching system capable of searching efficiently through the region's enormous volume of collected prints. Comparing a single unidentified crime scene print against the millions of prints already on file across the county would, using the manual visual comparison methods of the time, have taken investigators years, if it were even possible at all. His print and his identity simply sat in storage, waiting for technology that had not yet caught up to the scale of the investigation, an almost unbearable irony, given how close investigators already were to the answer without realizing it. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez drove into a residential neighborhood in Mission Viejo in Orange County, intending to target another home, roughly 76 miles from where he had begun that evening. A 13-year-old boy in the neighborhood, working on his motor scooter that evening in his own driveway, noticed a distinctive orange Toyota driving slowly through the area with its headlights off, an unusual enough detail to catch his attention, even though nothing about the moment seemed obviously alarming at the time. He wrote down a partial license plate number, a small, almost incidental act of attentiveness that would soon become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. The kind of ordinary teenage curiosity that, purely by chance, happened to intersect with one of the most significant manhunts in the state's history. That same night, Ramirez shot a man multiple times inside his home and sexually assaulted his fiancée, reportedly telling her during the attack that he was the Night Stalker and forcing her to swear an oath to Satan. Both survived. The partial license plate the boy had written down led investigators to the stolen orange Toyota, which was recovered abandoned in a Los Angeles neighborhood days later, having apparently been left behind once Ramirez realized it might be too closely associated with his movements that night. Inside that recovered vehicle, forensic technicians lifted a single, usable fingerprint from the rearview mirror, a small, easily overlooked detail that Ramirez, normally so careful about avoiding exactly this kind of mistake, had apparently failed to wipe clean. By the time that fingerprint was recovered, Los Angeles law enforcement had gained access to a newly implemented computerized fingerprint identification system, one of the first of its kind anywhere in the country, capable of searching and comparing prints far faster than the manual, visual comparison methods investigators had relied on for the entire case up to that point. The system had only recently become fully operational, meaning that had this fingerprint turned up even a year earlier, investigators might well have had no practical way to search it against the county's enormous existing database of prints at all. Technicians submitted the print from the abandoned Toyota into the new system, within a remarkably short period of searching, narrowing down what would otherwise have been an impossibly large pool of candidates. The system returned a match. The fingerprint belonged to Richard Ramirez, the same man arrested and released months earlier on the stolen vehicle charge, whose prints had been sitting, unmatched and unexamined, in police storage the entire time. Reports from officers who worked the case described technicians running the search by entering a partial name into the newly digitized records, initially returning only a handful of possible candidates named Richard, before the fingerprint comparison itself confirmed the exact match. For investigators who had spent over a year chasing an offender with no confirmed identity, working through thousands of dead-end tips and false leads, it was the breakthrough the entire case had been waiting for, arriving, almost improbably, just in time to matter. Looking back at the timeline of the investigation, it is difficult not to dwell on the roughly 8-month gap between Ramirez's routine arrest for auto theft in December of 1984 and his eventual identification through the same fingerprint the following August. During that window, Ramirez continued his spree largely unimpeded, committing a significant portion of his most violent crimes while his own fingerprints and his own booking photo already sat in police storage the entire time. It is a detail investigators who worked the case have returned to repeatedly in interviews over the decades since. The technology gap that allowed Ramirez to continue killing was not a matter of investigators missing an obvious clue in front of them, but rather a structural, technological limitation of the era itself, one that would be resolved industry-wide within just a few years, but arrived, in this particular case, only barely in time. On August 30th, 1985, Los Angeles police released Richard Ramirez's name and mugshot to the public, appearing on the front page of newspapers across the region the following morning, and broadcast repeatedly on local television and radio, transforming him overnight from an anonymous, unnamed terror into a fully identified fugitive with his face plastered across the entire city. Ramirez, unaware for at least part of that period that his identity had already been made public, had recently traveled to Arizona, spending roughly 2 days there before returning to Los Angeles by bus, seemingly still under the impression that he remained anonymous. On the morning of August 31st, 1985, only about 2 hours after arriving back in the city, he stepped off a Greyhound bus at the downtown Los Angeles station and walked into a nearby liquor store, where he reportedly saw his own photograph on the front page of a newspaper for the first time, learning in that single jarring moment that his months of anonymity had already come to an end. The scale of the media response once Ramirez's identity became public was, by the standards of the time, extraordinary. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast his photograph. Radio stations repeated descriptions of his last known movements throughout the day. Newspapers across the region ran the story above the fold, some publishing special afternoon editions specifically to get his face into circulation as quickly as possible. That saturation coverage, unusual for how quickly it moved from an official police release to nearly universal public awareness within a single news cycle, is widely credited as the single biggest factor in what happened next. Without it, Ramirez might easily have blended back into the city unnoticed, just as he had for the previous 14 months. Realizing he had been identified, Ramirez fled the liquor store on foot through the streets of East Los Angeles, attempting to steal a car to escape the growing attention around him. When the driver of that vehicle resisted and called for help, a growing crowd of local residents, alerted by the commotion and already familiar with his face from the widely circulated newspaper photo, began chasing him through the neighborhood on foot. Ramirez attempted to steal a second vehicle nearby, but was again thwarted, this time as a neighbor who heard the disturbance called for police assistance directly. Ramirez was eventually cornered and beaten by the group of citizens who caught him, restrained on the ground until police arrived to take him into custody, bringing his 14 months of violence to an end, not through a police takedown, but through the direct intervention of the very public he had spent over a year terrorizing. What months of coordinated law enforcement investigation, forensic analysis, and a brand new computer system had built toward was ultimately completed in its final moments by ordinary residents of the very community he had terrorized. A fittingly public conclusion to a case that had gripped the entire region for so long. Richard Ramirez's trial did not begin until years after his arrest, delayed by the sheer volume of evidence, the number of separate charges involved, and extensive pre-trial legal proceedings, including jury selection alone stretching on for months, given the case's overwhelming local notoriety. Prosecutors ultimately presented hundreds of individual pieces of evidence across the proceedings, methodically walking the jury through each of the crimes attributed to him. When proceedings finally opened, Ramirez showed little concern for the seriousness of what he was facing, at times appearing almost detached from the gravity of the charges laid out against him. At one court appearance, in July of 1988, he raised his hand to reveal a pentagram he had drawn on his own palm, declaring, "Hail Satan," as he left the courtroom. A moment that captured national media attention and reinforced the public image of him as an unrepentant, self-professed devotee of the occult. Throughout the trial, he also attracted a small but persistent group of female admirers who attended proceedings regularly, an unsettling phenomenon that would only grow more pronounced during his years afterward in prison. On October 3, 1989, the jury found Ramirez guilty on all charges: 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. He was formally sentenced to death, receiving 19 separate death sentences across his combined convictions, one of the most severe sentencing outcomes in California criminal history, reflecting the sheer scope of violence a single jury had been asked to weigh across more than a year of testimony. Over the course of the proceedings, prosecutors methodically walked jurors through the full geographic and temporal scope of Ramirez's crimes, case by case, building a picture of just how far his 14-month spree had actually reached. For many jurors and courtroom observers, it was the first time the full, connected scale of the violence had been laid out in one place, rather than experienced piecemeal through more than a year of scattered, often disconnected news coverage. The defense, for its part, offered little in the way of a coherent counter-narrative, focusing instead on procedural challenges to specific pieces of evidence rather than disputing the overall case against him. Given the sheer volume of forensic and eyewitness evidence prosecutors presented, few courtroom observers at the time considered the eventual guilty verdict to be in serious doubt. Ramirez spent the remainder of his life incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, awaiting an execution that would ultimately never take place during his lifetime, as his case worked through California's lengthy, multi-decade appeals process without ever reaching a final resolution. Despite the horror of his crimes, Ramirez developed an unusual following of admirers and correspondents during his years in prison, several of whom wrote to him regularly, a phenomenon researchers studying the psychology of violent crime fandom have pointed to repeatedly in the decades since. In 1996, 7 years to the day after his conviction, he married one of these correspondents, a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Leoy, in a ceremony held at San Quentin after the two had exchanged dozens of letters in the years leading up to their meeting in person. Leoy maintained a belief in Ramirez's innocence for years, visiting him regularly and reportedly stating at one point that she would take her own life if he were ever executed. The relationship eventually became strained, particularly after further DNA evidence years later connected him to additional crimes, and the two lived separately in every practical sense for the remainder of his life, though no formal divorce was ever finalized. Throughout his time on death row, Ramirez never expressed remorse for his crimes, maintaining, in the rare interviews he gave, a defiant and largely unrepentant attitude about what he had done. He continued to identify openly as a Satanist and showed little interest, by most accounts, in the kind of reflective self-examination that sometimes marks the final years of other long-incarcerated offenders. Richard Ramirez died at a hospital near San Quentin on June 7, 2013, at the age of 53. The cause of death was complications from lymphoma, a form of cancer, rather than execution, meaning that despite 19 separate death sentences, he ultimately died of natural causes after more than 2 decades on death row, having never faced the punishment a jury had formally handed down against him. His extended time on death row was, in many ways, a reflection of broader, systemic delays within California's capital punishment system, rather than anything specific to his own case. A pattern that has left the state with one of the largest death row populations in the country and one of the slowest rates of actually carrying out executions, with many condemned inmates, like Ramirez, ultimately dying of natural causes decades after their original sentencing. His death closed the final chapter of a case that had, more than 2 decades earlier, brought an entire region of California to a standstill out of sheer, sustained fear. Though for the survivors and families connected to his crimes, the sense of closure his death offered was, for many, complicated by the fact that he had never actually faced the sentence a jury had determined he deserved. Beyond the horror of the crimes themselves, the Night Stalker case left a lasting mark on how American law enforcement approaches forensic investigation. The fingerprint match that finally identified Ramirez came through one of the earliest large-scale uses of computerized fingerprint matching technology in the country, a system that had only recently become operational at the time investigators submitted the print recovered from his abandoned car. Had that same print been submitted even a year earlier, before the system existed, investigators might have had no realistic way to connect it to Ramirez's earlier arrest at all, and the case might well have remained unsolved for years, if not indefinitely. The case became one of the clearest, most widely cited early demonstrations of just how transformative computerized fingerprint databases could be for solving cases that would otherwise have remained cold indefinitely, helping accelerate the nationwide adoption of similar systems throughout the years that followed. Systems that continue, in more advanced form, to help solve cases across the country today. For the communities Ramirez terrorized throughout 1984 and 1985, the case also left a lasting psychological mark that outlasted his eventual capture and conviction by decades. Many residents who lived through that period have described a permanent, heightened wariness about home security that never fully faded, even years after Ramirez himself was safely behind bars. A quiet, lingering legacy of fear that rarely makes it into the more sensationalized retellings of his story. Richard Ramirez's 14 months of violence left behind a confirmed toll of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 11 sexual assaults, along with dozens of additional burglaries connected to his spree. Though, as with many prolific offenders from this era of American crime, some investigators and researchers who have studied his case in depth have suggested the true number of people he harmed may never be fully accounted for. What makes his story especially unsettling, even decades later, is not simply the brutality of his crimes, but how close the investigation came to stalling permanently, saved only by the arrival of new technology at almost exactly the moment it was needed most, and by the final, decisive intervention of ordinary citizens who refused to let him simply disappear back into the crowd. Had that computerized fingerprint system come online even a few months later, or had a 13-year-old boy not happened to glance up from his motor scooter at exactly the right moment, the entire trajectory of the case and the number of additional victims Ramirez might have gone on to claim could have looked very different. His story has, in the decades since, become one of the most studied and, at times, uncomfortably romanticized cases in American true crime, a tension between the horror of his actual crimes and the strange cultural fascination that has followed him ever since his arrest. That fascination says as much about how society processes extreme violence as it does about Ramirez himself. For 14 months, Richard Ramirez chose his victims essentially at random, breaking into homes across an entire region with no discernible pattern investigators could reliably predict. It took a stolen car, a 13-year-old boy's attention to detail, and a fingerprint system just barely ready in time to finally bring his reign of terror to an end. And even then, it was the community itself, not a badge or a courtroom, that physically brought him down in the final moment.